Hello, in this video we're going to continue our discussion of unemployment. We'll be looking at how to calculate the unemployment rate and going into more detail about who is counted in the official unemployment numbers. So first we're going to start with our working age population. That's this box at the top. This includes all people who are 16 years and older. So working age population. This does not include the entire population, right? Just people who are working age. Then we're going to split that up into people who are in the labor force and people who are not in the labor force. So let's start with the labor force side. So people who are in the labor force either are employed, so you have some sort of job. You're working either part-time or full-time. You could have one job, you can have 5 jobs, but any person who is working counts as employed. And this is counting the number of people. So not the number of jobs, not the number of hours. If you have 5 jobs, you're just counted as one person. And then the number of people who are unemployed. So again, this is the number of people. This has to do with people who are actively looking for work. So it's not just that you don't have a job and that you want one. You actually have to be looking for a job. You have to be available for work. If somebody offers you a job, you have to be able to take it. And then everyone else is considered not in the labor force. So if you're not actively looking for a job and you don't have a job, you're not part of the labor force. So not in the labor force. First, people who are not available for work. People who don't want to work. This could be like students who are going to school full-time, who are not working. This could be parents who have taken some time off of work so they could stay home and watch their children. This is anybody who's pursuing something outside of a job. They're not available for work for personal reasons, for practical reasons, but they're not looking for a job. If someone offered them, they wouldn't take it. We also have some people who are not in the labor force that aren't working, but actually are available to work and possibly would like to have a job. The first category is going to be discouraged workers. This is people who have given up actively looking for work. So they may have been accounted for in the unemployment numbers for several months, several years, for a long time, maybe a short time, but they've given up actively looking for work. They don't think there are jobs out there. Maybe they think, oh, I need to go get some new training, new skills. Maybe they're structurally unemployed, and so they don't have the skills that employers are looking for, and they just give up looking. These would be discouraged workers. But if they did have the skills, or if a job came available, if somebody offered them work, they would take it, right? They would willingly jump back into the labor force if they thought they could get a job. And then the other category, this is people who want to be working but maybe have some difficulty with a job. Maybe it's transportation issues. So I don't have reliable transportation. I would love to work and I would love to have a job, but the bus is not consistent in my area, and I don't have a way to get there. I don't have a way to get to work all the time. Maybe there's childcare issues. There's some sort of barrier preventing people from having a job, but they do want to be working. They are available for work, but there's just some other barrier. And so the people who are not working but available, these people are potentially undercounted when we're looking at the total unemployment rate. We're not counting people who maybe we should be. So if we see an unemployment rate of 5%, it's only referring to these people who are actively looking for work. And if this number is large enough, these not in the labor force people who want to be working, then our unemployment rate might be severely misrepresenting what's going on in our society. So how do we get the actual official unemployment rate? You may be surprised, or maybe this makes sense to you. It's not done by counting every single person who doesn't have a job who wants to work. It's done through an estimate with a survey that randomly calls 60,000 households in the United States. And as long as this is a representative sample, it's a randomly selected sample, it's going to give us a good approximation of what's happening in the entire country. We don't actually have to count each individual person to know what these numbers are. But this only works if we're getting a random and representational sample of the entire population. It collects data on about 100,000 adults, because while looking at 60,000 households, there are going to be more than one adult per household in a lot of those cases. It asks for people who are 16 years of age or older. So are you or anyone in your house 16 years or older? Have you or anyone in your household looked for work during the past 4 weeks? Have you or anyone in your household, are you available for work? Are you available to accept a job? And if you answer yes to all of these 3 questions, then you are counted as unemployed. They also obviously will ask, are you currently working? So if you say yes, you're working, they don't necessarily have to answer the rest of those questions. Okay. If you currently have a job, but you're actively looking for a new job, that doesn't count as unemployed. So when we're calculating the unemployment rate, we're going to need the number of people who are unemployed divided by the number of people in the labor force. Now, whenever you see this word here, rate means we're going to be calculating some sort of percentage. So unemployment rate, 5%. Inflation rate, 2%. So whenever you see this rate here, it means we're going to calculate some sort of percentage. So rather than just looking at the total number of people, we want to see the total number of people as a percentage of our labor force, or of that total group. The labor force includes people who are currently working and people who are actively looking for a job. So number of employed plus number of unemployed. Working age population is everybody who's 16 years old and older who are not institutionalized or retired. Discouraged workers are people without a job who are not actively looking but want to work. Anybody not in the labor force, it means they're not available, or they're available but they're not actively looking. Right? They're not working. And if you're employed, you have a job, whether it's full-time or part-time. So if you work 1 hour a week, you're considered employed. If you work 0 hours a week, that would be unemployed. Okay, so how do we calculate this? Okay, oftentimes in a question, you're going to get a big list that talks about lots of different people. So it may say, we have a population size of 5,000. 5,000 people in this population. There are 2,000 people who are working full-time. There are 500 people working part-time. There are 500 people who are discouraged workers. They've given up looking. There are 1,000 people who are actively looking for work but don't have a job. There are 800 people who are not available. And there are 200 people who are available but not able to work for some reason. And so then the question might say, what is the unemployment rate in this society? We want to calculate that. And so your goal here is to look through this list and figure out which people are we counting and which people aren't we counting. So we want to know the number of people who are unemployed divided by the labor force, which is the number of unemployed divided by the number of people who are employed. Okay, so we want to pick out a couple numbers here. So we want people who are working full-time and part-time. And we want the people who are actively looking but don't have a job. So all of these numbers together are going to make up our total labor force. So our labor force in this case is going to be 3,500. Our number of people who are unemployed is going to be 1,000. So we'd say 1,000 divided by 3,500. And then since we want to get a percentage, we're going to multiply this by 100, like we've done in past examples. So 1,000 divided by 3,500 gives you 0.2857, which is the same thing as 28.57%. Okay. Almost 29% of the people in our whole labor force are currently looking for work but can't find jobs. Sometimes you might see this number go down. So let's say they're reporting, oh, there's 28% unemployment rate. And then next quarter, they say, oh, it's gone down. Now, instead of 28%, it's gone down to 16%. And you might think, oh, that's great. Unemployment rate's going down. That must mean more people have jobs. Not necessarily. It could be that we've actually increased the size of our discouraged workers. Maybe those 1,000 people looked for work so long that half of them just gave up. And now we only have 500 people who are still working, or still looking for work, and 1,000 people now who've given up working. And in that case, what happens is our total labor force size drops to 3,000, and the total number of unemployed people drops to 500. And so 500 divided by 3,000 is 0.1667, or 16.67%. So it could be that we have a drop in the unemployment rate because some people just said, never mind, I give up. I'm going to quit looking for work. And so we don't just want to look at the whole number. We want to look at how many people were unemployed and what's the size of the labor force. Because as both of those numbers change, it can have a very dramatic impact on this unemployment rate, but doesn't necessarily mean that things are improving. If instead our labor force stayed at 3,500 and our unemployment rate dropped to 16%, that would mean only maybe 560 people were unemployed, and the rest of those people moved up to working. Maybe the rest of them got full-time jobs. So now we've got 24,440. Okay, so this would be a happy statistic. Yay, more people got jobs. Okay, unemployment rate went down. So we want to look at the whole picture to see what's going on here. So if you get a word problem that's talking about how many people are in the population, some people are working part-time, some people full-time, there are students who are going to school not looking for work, you want to go through that list and figure out which people am I counting as unemployed, which people am I counting in the labor force, and which people are we ignoring in this calculation. So it is an accurate unemployment rate. It depends. It gives us some information. It's helpful when we're using to compare over time. But there are people who want to work who aren't counted. There can be a very high number of discouraged workers, especially after a period of creative destruction or after a really long recession. There may be a lot of people who actually want to work who are not counted. There's also the problem of labor underutilization. So if you're counted as employed, this means you're working at all, right? You're working 1 or more hours. But you might want to work 40 hours. You might want to work 60 hours, right? There's a lot of people who are working part-time who want to be working full-time, and the unemployment rate doesn't capture that. So it could be that we have only 10 people who are working full-time and 2,500 people who are working part-time. If all of these people are looking for a lot more work, they would be considered underemployed, right, or underutilized. And so the unemployment rate doesn't capture that, doesn't capture the fact that people want more hours or they want better pay. They're looking for something different. It doesn't account for people in low-paying jobs. So maybe you're in a low-skilled market, a low-skilled job. You might actually have higher skills. Maybe you have finished college now, or you came back to work after a period of absence, but you're in some sort of job or industry that doesn't really match your skills, doesn't match your interests. And so you might want to earn more money, but because you're working in any job in any capacity, you're not counted in that unemployment rate. You're being underutilized. Generally, the statistic that you hear when you hear the unemployment rate, it's called U3, unemployment 3. This is the most commonly used unemployment rate. This is the one you're going to hear reported in the news. Generally, this is what's used by government agencies, but it does not include everything. There are other measures of unemployment as well. Another one that I think is interesting to look at is called U6, and it does include discouraged workers and people who need more hours or more money. So why don't we use U6? Like, why do we use U3 if your U6 encompasses a lot more people? I don't know. Some people say that we don't really want to get at some of the more serious structural unemployment that's going on in the market, and maybe discouraged workers is counting that. Or it's good for certain types of programs, but it's not a good indicator of more temporary or immediate changes in real GDP. Here is a graph that's found from the Federal Reserve Bank in St. Louis, and this is comparing U3 unemployment rate to the U6 measure of unemployment. You can see here that they actually move in a similar direction. So when U3 is going up, U6 is going up, and that gap between them stays fairly consistent. Although you could see here at the end of our recession in 2009, that gap actually jumps quite a bit. So U3 unemployment rate at the end of this recession is probably about 9%. And the U6 unemployment rate is probably closer to 16%. So here we have a gap of about 7%, 7% difference. Whereas if you pick an earlier point, right, maybe like right here, say about 2007, we've got 8% at U6 and 4% for U3. So now we only have a 4% difference. So after the recession, we have a big jump. There's a lot of people who became discouraged workers. There's a lot of industries who sort of changed how they did things in the production process and increased the number of people who are structurally unemployed. Depending on their age and their mindset and other things, they may not feel like they're able to train for a new set of skills to get a new type of job. But one thing to notice is that these lines do move in the same direction, which means that the amount of unemployment in U6 is not changing very often. So the main fluctuation in these unemployment rates really does come from U3. It does come from some of these more temporary measures. And so we don't necessarily need to report U6 because most of the variation happens in U3. Sometimes we'll see, like at the end of the 2009 recession, we have a big jump. So we have some increase in the general level of discouraged workers and people who are marginally attached to the labor force. And then that sort of stays consistent over time, or it changes much more slowly. So we don't necessarily need to report U6. Really what people are trying to get at when they're reporting U3 is they're trying to say, what's changing? What are the things that are varying from this quarter to last quarter? So which statistic is used almost doesn't matter because what a lot of statisticians and investors and politicians care about is how much did it change from last time? And you're going to see similar changes regardless of which statistic you use. The only difference is in U6, sometimes you may have a big change in the number of discouraged workers, and as it goes down, it might go down a lot slower. And so for some measures of the health of your economy, reporting U6 might not be helpful to see if policies are having a quick effect or an immediate effect on the economy. In the United States, we also have something called unemployment insurance. This is something that began after the Great Depression. So during the Great Depression, there was no unemployment insurance or unemployment benefits. If you lost your job, you simply did not have any more income. Unemployment insurance replaces a portion of a worker's income if they lose their job. It's not going to replace your whole income. It's going to be based on how much you earned, up to a maximum amount per week. These are temporary benefits. In the US, mostly it lasts for up to 6 months or up to 26 weeks. During the 2008 recession, it got extended up to 99 weeks because the recession was taking such a long time. It was taking companies a long time to recover. People were not getting hired back as quickly after the recession ended, and so Congress passed some temporary laws to allow people to get unemployment benefits for up to 2 years. Generally, it's about up to maximum of $450 per week, and it's between 50 and 60% of your income while you are working. During COVID, especially the early parts in 2020, there was actually an increase in the unemployment benefits. Temporary increase up to an extra $600 per week, which means people could be taking home $1,050 per week from unemployment benefits. And this extra $600 was not linked to your previous income. So the $450 or however much you got for this plus $600 meant actually a lot of people were earning more money being unemployed than they were while they were working. This was actually part of the government's strategy. They wanted people to stay home. So they wanted to take away the incentive for you to try to sneak into work or feel pressure to go to work when they wanted people to stay home because they were trying to prevent this disease from spreading. The better the benefits, the more people have an incentive to stay unemployed longer. You maybe want to take longer to find a better job. If my unemployment benefits are going to end next week, I'm going to have a lot more pressure to accept jobs that are available right now rather than looking for a job that might be a better fit. If I could take up to 99 weeks, I might not get a job for 60 or 70 weeks rather than getting one in 20 to 25. And so we see those patterns happening around the country as unemployment benefits change. The more generous the benefits, the longer people will stay there. So if we're trying to calculate the unemployment rate, we have to ask first, is the person working? Yes or no? If the answer is yes, we count them as employed. If the answer is no, we need to ask, are they looking and available for work? If the answer is yes, we'll count them as unemployed. If the answer is no, they're not in the labor force. So the unemployment rate in November of 2010 was actually 9.8%. This was almost a year and a half after the recession ended, and we still had relatively high unemployment. To calculate that number, we see that there were 15,000 people unemployed, divided by our labor force, which is going to be those 15,000 people, plus the 138,000 employed people. This gives you a number of 0.098 multiplied by 100, and we see that that is 9.8%. So let's look at some comparisons of unemployment rates over time. So during the Great Depression in the 1930s, we had unemployment rates of 25%. In 2008 recession, we had peak unemployment rates closer to 10%. Now, something to remember here is these are not necessarily apples to apples comparisons. Because during the Great Depression, there was no unemployment insurance, right? No benefits. If you lost your job, your income was zero. There was no welfare. There was very little government assistance. Additionally, often households only had one working adult, which meant if you lost your job, your entire household lost their full set of income. 25% unemployment during the Great Depression potentially meant that 1/4 of all households in the U.S. had no income for the years of the Great Depression. In the 2008 recession, often there were other people still working in the household. There was unemployment benefits people could collect for almost up to 2 years, meaning that households could have 50 to 75% of their pre-recession income compared to 0% income during the Great Depression. So really, these two time periods are not comparable at all. The Great Depression was very devastating for the economy, devastating for families. After the Great Depression, the U.S. government and other economies around the world developed lots of social programs to sort of prevent this from happening and to help people so that we weren't in a situation where so many people had no income. The predictions for 2020 after COVID hit was that we would have unemployment rates up to 32%. We saw governments stepping into action very quickly, sending out stimulus payments and coming up with programs, increasing unemployment insurance to try to prevent the economy from going into a really bad recession. Actual unemployment rates for 2020 were around 6% to 13%. A lot of people were actually able to work from home who hadn't been able to previously. Companies were able to adjust and shift work mode so that they didn't have to lay people off, they didn't have to reduce productivity. In August of 2022, unemployment rates dropped down to 3.7%. They stayed relatively low for quite a while. The predictions for unemployment from the COVID pandemic just didn't happen. There was not a massive recession. You could argue that the government did a good job. They prevented the recession, they stabilized the economy, they helped people have money and keep buying stuff so people didn't have to be laid off. Or maybe it's because we had the technology, the ability to shift work so that we could work from home, even when things were shut down. So comparing unemployment rates requires deeper analysis than just looking at the total rate or the number of unemployed workers. We really do need to look at what benefits were available, how many people are working in the household, how was total household income actually affected by that level of unemployment. It's a lot easier to compare unemployment rates between years that are close than comparing over long periods of time. We could probably compare COVID pandemic numbers to the 2008 recession. A lot of similar conditions, but still not quite the same. Comparing 2008, though, to the 1930s is a lot trickier. So many things have changed. So we really just want to be conscious and thinking about all of those underlying characteristics and not wipe away too much information when we just convert everything to unemployment rates. The Phillips curve was developed in 1950s by looking at decades worth of data on wage inflation and unemployment. And A.W. Phillips noticed that there was a relationship between these two things. And he noticed that inflation and unemployment tended to be in opposite directions. So when there was high inflation, there was usually low unemployment. Or when there was low unemployment, there was high inflation. When there was high unemployment, there was low inflation, right? And so they were opposites. Partly this happens because labor costs represent about 2/3 of a firm's production costs. And so when we have wage inflation, wages increasing, even though productivity is not increasing, this leads to price inflation. So if I have to pay my workers twice as much money to produce the same amount of stuff, most likely I'm going to raise the price that I'm selling my stuff for. If your real wages go up, that means there's no inflation. You're getting paid more because you're being more productive. But when we have wage inflation, it's going up. Prices are going up. Productivity isn't going up. Generally, unemployment is going to move in the opposite direction. So he developed this model with the idea that there's sort of a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. And many governments and economies, the central bank, right, the Federal Reserve, tried to balance these, and they said, okay, if we want low unemployment, we might have to deal with inflation. Or if we want to have low inflation, we might have to deal with high unemployment. But something that has appeared, at least over the most recent decades, is that having long-term stable inflation rates actually breaks down this relationship between wage inflation and unemployment. And so even though this was true in the 1950s, this relationship doesn't really seem to hold any longer, especially in light of current government and Federal Reserve policies. Now, in 2022 and 2023, we do see very low levels of unemployment and relatively high inflation. And so it seems like this is happening again, but it's not as consistent of a relationship as it had been in the past. And so models like these are one of the reasons why we need to be constantly reviewing and analyzing and evaluating our models, and not just assuming that these things continue to always be true. Some of this has happened because the Federal Reserve Bank in the US is very effective at keeping inflation rates close to 2%. At least they had been for several decades before the high inflation after the COVID pandemic. And their ability to do this through changing of the money supply, buying and selling securities, which we'll talk more about in the monetary policy chapter, sort of broke down this relationship so that we could have low inflation and low unemployment, which both are goals of governments and economies. But we will talk more about that in later chapters, and this will be the end of our unemployment video.